Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Lillahi ta'ala, correct your intentions. We have 4 pages to cover today, insha'Allah. We're going to repeat, insha'Allah ta'ala, some of what we mentioned last week about pure and purifying water. For anyone who hasn't learned about some of these rules pertaining to water, please pay attention very well, insha'Allah, so that everything is clear. So the author said, the 5th condition, conditions of purification. Conditions for the wudu and ghusl to be valid. These conditions are shared between wudu and ghusl. The 5th condition is to use pure and purifying water. Pure, tahir, means that it is not filthy. And purifying, tahur, or mutahhir, means that it promotes purity in other things. It makes other things pure. So the water could be pure in and of itself. That means it's not filthy water, which we'll talk about inshallah tonight. And the water could even be purifying to other things. That's why we use water for purification. The scholar said that water is the tool of purification. It would have been suitable to merely say that purifying water is the condition. And that's what the Shaykh actually said. If we just read what's in the red, that's the translation of the Shaykh's words. He said to use purifying water. Our explanation that's built around these statements adds pure. We said the 5th condition is to use pure and purifying water. It would have been suitable to merely say that purifying water is the condition, and that's what the Shaykh did. Because if it is purifying, then it is certainly pure. So you don't have to say pure and purifying. If you just say purifying, it automatically means pure. But the opposite is not necessarily true, as will come. Meaning, it could be pure, but not purifying. If it's purifying, then it's pure, but if it's pure, doesn't mean that it's purifying. We'll discuss that, inshallah. It is mentioned as both pure and purifying here in our explanation because it is important to understand the difference between water being pure and being purifying. I.e., for the validity of purification, one must use the water that has not changed, i.e., its qualities, which are its color, taste, and smell, have not changed significantly by being mixed and blended. The blending is the fusion between the water and what fell into the water, in such a way that the naked eye cannot distinguish the two. So for the validity of purification, one must use the water that has not changed, i.e., its qualities, which are its color, taste, and smell, have not changed significantly by being mixed, i.e., blended, which is the fusion between the water and what fell into it, in such a way that the naked eye cannot distinguish the two. So we gave examples. Let's say you have warm water and tea leaves. So you let those tea leaves soak in that warm water. And then the water's qualities, its color, taste, and smell will change. If it changes significantly by this blending, then it is not valid for purification. What do we mean if it changes significantly? We will explain it, insha'Allah ta'ala. That will come clear now, insha'Allah. if the water blended with a pure material, not a filthy material, we're not talking about any filth right now. We'll talk about the filth getting into the water at the end. If the water blended with a pure material, then it remains pure and does not become filthy. And soon we will discuss the water becoming filthy. However, there are details to the purifying power of this blended water. It's still pure, didn't become filthy, but is it purifying? There are details. A, if the change in the water is very slight, so insignificant and faint that you can still call that liquid water, like a swimming pool with chlorine, then it is still purifying. So you have a swimming pool. You step into the area where the swimming pool is and you smell the chlorine in the air. That chlorine that they mixed into the water. So now that water is changed because of something that blended with the water. Is that change so significant that we cannot use the water in the swimming pool for purification? Then you ask yourself the question, do I still refer to this liquid here as water? Or do I have to now adjust its name to something else? Do I have to call it chlorine water? Or is it enough just to call it water? We still call it water. As long as you can still call it water, as long as its change isn't so significant that it loses its original name of water, then you can use it for purification. So if the change in the water is very slight, so insignificant and faint that you can still call that liquid water, like a swimming pool with chlorine, then it is still purifying. I gave you an example last time. Let's say you had a bottle of soda pop. You finished everything in it, and maybe there's a little bit left in the bottom of the bottle. And then you filled that bottle with water after that. And now this water, you can slightly smell the soda pop. And you might even be able to slightly see a tint of the color of it. And if you drink the water, you can slightly taste it. But the change in this water is so slight that you still call it water. So this water is still usable for purification. It has not lost its purifying power. If it has blended with something such as milk, sugar, flour, mountain salt, not sea salt, mountain salt, meaning the salt from the land, not sea salt, or ink, i.e. something pure, not filthy, that blends with the water, fuses with the water, from which the water can be ordinarily shielded. So it's easy to keep this stuff out of the water usually. It's ordinarily easy to not get that stuff in your water. Then if the water changes significantly because of its mixing with some material, i.e. it changed in such a way that it is not validly called mere water anymore. Rather, it lost its name and must now be called sugar water, or tea, or coffee, or the like, then using this liquid that can no longer be called mere water for purification is not valid. To make it clearer, original water, regardless of whether it fell from the sky or sprang from the earth, and regardless of its qualities, as long as it is as Allah originally created it, doesn't matter how it tastes or how it smells or its color, if it is the way Allah created it, if it came out of the sky like that, or if it came out of the ground like that, it can be plainly and literally called water without that being a figure of speech. and it has a purifying power automatically from the beginning. If you encounter some water, you don't have to say to yourself, did this water lose its purifying power and is no longer valid for purification? No. Rather, the default, meaning the automatic way it's supposed to be from the beginning, is that if it's water, it's purifying, as long as it's the way Allah created it. Thus, it is not a condition to call the salty seawater, or ocean water, or salt water. Nor is it a condition to call sky water, rainwater. Rather, it is enough to simply call all of those different types water, in the literal sense of the word, regardless of their color, smell, or flavor. The same is true for well water, spring water, river water, etc. Even the water that sprang from between the fingers of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam can be called simply water. On the other hand, some things cannot be called mere water and rather must be accompanied by a qualifying description. Qualifying means specifying. Or, if they are called water, it is a figure of speech, meaning, we just clarified now, what do we mean by water? Some things, you can't just call them water. You need to attach something, like we're going to talk about. Or, also, some things, they might be called water, but it's a figure of speech because they're not actually water. For example, rose water cannot be merely called water. Rather, the word rose must be attached. They call that in English a compound noun. Compound noun, it means it's made from two parts. Sometimes such a noun has a dash between its two components, and sometimes it doesn't. Two types of compound nouns. The type that's its parts are separated by a dash, and the type that's not. Also, urine, semen, and some other fluids might be called water, but as a figure of speech. Like, if a pregnant woman, her water broke, that's not real water. Or if a sick person could not contain his water, meaning that he urinates on himself. That's a figure of speech, this usage of water. Once true water blends with something and changes so drastically that it loses its name and is no longer validly called water, then it is no longer purifying. But it is still pure, meaning that it didn't become najis. For example, as we already said, warm water in which tea leaves soaked changes in color, taste, and smell to the extent that it is no longer proper to call it water. It must now be called tea. Making purification with this is invalid. Know that some material may blend with water, change it greatly, and yet the water retains its purifying power. So there are three things we're going to mention here that may blend with water, change that water greatly, and the water still retains its purifying power. 1, sea salt. The scholars said that sea salt is like ice. It is created from the water like ice, and if it dissolves in water, it is like ice melting in water. Therefore, it has no effect on the purifying power of the water because it is from the water, even if someone intentionally put it in the water. As for mountain salt, it does not have the same judgment. 2, soil. As for soil, the scholars said that it does not take the water out of the reality of being water, as long as it does not become mud. Rather, it merely makes the water murky. Therefore, it is valid to use murky water for purification, even if someone purposefully put it in the water. I gave you an example last time. A ground saturated in water. If you step down onto it, your foot goes down into the ground, and then brown water comes up. As your foot goes down, you're squeezing the water out and it comes up. Brown, for example, or whatever color the soil is. This water is still water, although it's murky, or someone might even call it dirty water. You can use that for purification. You might not want to drink it, but you can take it and splash it on your face and wash it on your arms if that doesn't harm you. And the third thing is what is difficult to keep out of the water. The Sheikh said, if, however, the water changes because of its mixing, i.e. blending with materials which are in its original place, the water's original place, such as moss or algae, or in its pathway, something that's in the water's pathway, such as water that flows over sulfur, it's on the ground and the water flows over it, or springs from a mine, water that springs from a mine, so it has in it whatever is in its pathway, or water that flows through rusty pipes, so it has the rust in it. And those two cases, i.e. what is in the water's place or the water's pathway, that's what you need to remember here. When we say what is difficult to keep out of the water, we mean in two cases. What's in the water's place, where the water settles, what's in its place, like if it's a lake, so that's where the water is, or a pond, or what's in the water's pathway. These two cases, i.e. what is in the water's place or pathway, are also excluded from the rule of what blends and changes the water greatly. If, however, the water changes because of its mixing with materials which are in its original place or its pathway, and from which the water is easily shielded, i.e. normally shielded, then this does not affect, i.e. it does not remove the purifying property of this water, meaning it remains purifying although it changed greatly by what was in its place or pathway. Any question about that? Does this shielding have details? Just what we have mentioned as far as whether it's easy to keep it out of the water or not. If it's something that's easy to shield from or shield the water from it, meaning it's easy to keep it out of the water, that's what it means. So those examples we gave, milk, sugar, ink, is it difficult to keep that stuff out of your water? No, it's easy to shield your water from those things, right? That's what's meant here. It means normally you can keep it out of the water. What is it that you cannot normally keep out of the water? Or what is it that you cannot easily keep out of the water? Whatever's in the water's place, and whatever's in the water's pathway. So since it's difficult to keep that out of the water, that's excused. Even if it changes the water greatly, you can still use it for purification. So that's clear. The author said, likewise, water retains its purifying power if it changed because of being stale. That means old. The reason it changed is because it's been sitting for a long time. You can still use it for purification. Or by something in its vicinity, in its area. Not contacting the water, it's just in the area of the water. Such as a rotting carcass that did not actually touch the water, but its stench, that means its stink, is in the water because it's close to the water. So that's why it changed. It changed because of the air in the vicinity. That's why. The rotting animal was stinking. The air around that rotting animal adapted to the smell of that animal. Then the water around that air adapted to the smell of the air. Then when you washed your face for wudu, you smelled the stinking mousse in the water. This is valid. That's valid, not invalid. Or by something that does not blend or dissolve, like a stick, stone, or oil, even if it changed the water significantly. So if you had some water and you put a stone in there or a stick in there, and then the water changed greatly because of that, you can still use this for purification. Because these objects do not dissolve in the water. So if it happened to be a stick that, let's say, because it sat in the water so long that it started to disintegrate and started to break into small pieces to the extent that it could blend with the water, and then it changed the water, then that will affect the water because now it's blending. But as a solid stick or a solid rock sitting in the water, it will not remove the purifying power of the water, even if it changes the water significantly, because it doesn't blend with the water. From what has been mentioned, it is understood that the ability to drink the water is irrelevant. We're not talking about that. From what has been mentioned, it is understood that the ability to drink the water is irrelevant to its purifying power or to the validity of using it for purification. As for being unable to use the water because you're sick or because the water itself is dangerous, that will come in the chapter of tayammum, period. What does it mean to say that it blended? They had two ways to explain that. They said blending means that you cannot tell the difference between that material and the water with the naked eye. That's one way they explained blending. Or you cannot physically separate that material from the water. That's another way they explained blending. The rule is what does not blend with the water does not remove the purifying power of the water, even if the water changes significantly. So stale water, change of color, taste, and or smell does not take away its purifying qualities. Correct. Stale water sometimes has a stink. Yeah. Or maybe it tastes really funny, for example. Tayyib, let's continue. 6. The sixth condition, as already implied, is that the water not be filthy. It was already implied because it was just said that it is a condition that the water be pure and purifying. Perhaps that is why the translators did not make it a sixth condition. Because if we're saying that it has to be pure and purifying, that means it can't be filthy. So would there be a need to say that's a sixth condition? It means the same thing. So maybe that's why they didn't do that. However, it might be said that this issue has enough details to make it an independent subject, or else it will become a digression under the previous condition. Has this case of filthy water has enough details to make it its own subject. So it might be said that it could be a sixth condition just because of how lengthy the discussion about it can be. Or it's just still more talk coming from the fifth condition that we're just finished talking about. So know that if the water is plenty, i.e., an abundant amount, which in the terminology of the Shafi'is is the volume of 2 kullas or more, then its great quantity makes it resistant to contamination by filth. Thus, it does not become filthy, nor does it lose its purifying power, no matter how much filth falls into it, as long as it does not change. Great example, the ocean. Doesn't matter how much najis falls into the ocean. It's not going to become filthy as long as it doesn't change. So, for those of you who may have public swimming pools where any dirty little kids can go and play around them and just pee in the swimming pool, know that that water doesn't become contaminated as long as the water doesn't change, because it's a lot of water. Thus, it does not become filthy, nor does it lose its purifying power, no matter how much filth falls into it, as long as it does not change. 2 kullas fill a cubical container 1.5 cubits wide, long, and deep. Or a cylindrical container, that means like a circle. Cubical means like a square. Cylindrical container like a circle. 1 cubit across and 2.5 cubits deep. Some scholars measuring the 2 kullas by the weight of rittles. They say 2 kullas equals so and so many rittles. But rittle is a weight, not a volume, a weight. This does not negate the fact that the kulla is a measure by volume, not by weight, i.e. by space. Basically means the container. How much does the container hold? Not how heavy it is. How much space does it take up? That's called volume when you're talking about measuring. Not volume about sound, how loud it is or how low it is. How much space it takes up. Their doing so is only for additional exactness and verification of its amount. To say the 2 kullas weigh so and so many rittles. To use this large amount of water for purification, it is a condition that it, i.e. the water, must not have changed, not even slightly, because of its contact with a najis filth, i.e. by the filth falling into the water. We're not talking about the water coming on top of the filth. We're talking about the filth coming on top of the water. Make the difference between those two. Therefore, changing because of filth is not like changing by blending with a pure material. Is not like changing by blending with a pure material. Changing because of filth is not like changing by blending with a pure material. If the water changes because of a pure material blending with it, then that water is still pure and purifying if the change is only slight. That's what we finished just saying a moment ago. However, if what changed the water was filth, then it becomes filthy even if the change were only slight. See the difference? If the water changes by something pure, it is still usable if the change was only slight. If the water, the large amount of water changed by something najis, it all becomes filthy and unusable if the change is only slight. It may still be called water, however, it is filthy water. Know, though, that if there is abundant water beyond those 2 kullas that were changed by filth, like a swimming pool in which only a corner was contaminated, then only the changed area is filthy, not the entire pool. This is because beyond that contaminated area, there may be tens or even hundreds of kullas resisting that filth. So you have a corner where there's najasa, but then you still have the rest of the pool. Beyond that area where there's some change, there's still kulla after kulla after kulla after kulla resisting that filth. If, however, the volume of the water is less than 2 kullas, then it is technically a small amount of water, like a sink or a bucket or a small puddle or a cup. Don't forget that a puddle could be a small amount of water too. So before you put some najasa into the puddle, you contaminate all of the puddle. Thus, an unexempted, unexcused, not exempted, not excused, and unexempted. Unexcused meaning an effective filth, a contaminating najis filth. It's not excused. which is a filth that causes filthiness in the water, must not have contacted the water by falling or being thrown into it. Again, remember the difference between the najasa coming into the water and the water coming over the najasa. That's the second time we're mentioning it. Must not have contacted the water by falling in or being thrown into the water. So, we said last time, and we will repeat in the future, bi'ithnillah, that there's two types of najasa, depending on which way you look at it. There's different ways, all sorts of ways to look at najasa. We'll see some of them. One way is to look at it from the perspective of its effectiveness, its ability to contaminate. Didn't we just finish talking about whether water can promote purity and other things? Now we're talking about filth. Can filth promote filthiness and other things? Just like sometimes water does not promote purity in other things, meaning it's not purifying. It's pure, but it's not purifying. Also, sometimes there's najasa that does not promote filthiness in other things. So it's filthy, but it's not contaminating. It's excused or overlooked. We'll come back, inshallah, to talk about that. An unexempted, unexcused, meaning an effective contaminating najis filth, which is a filth that causes filthiness in the water, must not have contacted the water by falling or being thrown into it. We're talking about a little bit of water now. We finished talking about a lot of water. If it did, then the water will become filthy, even if it, meaning the filth, does not change the water. This is because a small amount of water lacks the power to resist filth, and thus becomes filthy on contact, even if it does not change. Therefore, if one were to spit blood into a mere bucket of water, all of the water becomes filthy, even if the water does not change. The issue of water flowing over the filth instead of filth falling into the water will be addressed later, God willing. So put that mas'ala to the side so that when it comes, you're already mentally prepared for it. We've just discussed the case of najasa falling into water. We have not discussed the case of pouring water over the najasa yet. Moreover, as you know, water is created with a purifying power that may vanish, even though the water itself remains pure. So a seventh condition is that the water must not have been used already, because the impure part being washed will withdraw the purifying power from the water to achieve purity, and the water will withdraw the impurity from the part. Thus, the water is no longer purifying. So, why you can't use used water? Because used water loses its purifying power. It remains pure, but it loses its purifying power. Why does used water lose its purifying power? Because when you put that water on your organ with the intention, the organ withdraws the purifying power out of the water so that the organ becomes pure. The organ takes that quality from the water so that the organ becomes pure. And the water takes the impurity out of the organ. So that leaves the water not purifying anymore. So now you cannot use it. Renders the water no longer purifying. As is known to you, if it is no longer purifying, it cannot be used to lift a religious impurity, nor a physical one. The religious impurity is the hadath that makes you obligated to make wudu or ghusl. The physical impurity is the najas. You have hadath and najas. Or sometimes instead of najas, they say khabath. Hadath and khabath. Or hadath and najas. Therefore, if someone used water to clean filth, the spot is still filthy, even if all the traces of the filth vanished. There was a spot of najasa, you came with a bucket of used water somehow, and then you poured that used water over the najasa, and you wiped away all the najasa, it's all gone now. What's the judgment of that spot? It's still filthy. The judgment of the spot is that it's still filthy, even if all the traces of the filth vanished. In such a case, it will become the undetectable filth that will be discussed later. In this case, it's called najasa hukmiyah, undetectable filth. And we'll come to talk about that. Because filth, from another perspective, can be detectable or undetectable. So there's all sorts of ways you can categorize filth. He said if the spot was on a garment, okay. So just the spot, that's where the najasa is. That's where the contamination, not the entire garment. If, for example, the najasa was on the cuff of a sleeve, that doesn't make the collar filthy or the other sleeve filthy or anything like that. Just the spot that's contaminated. Water is considered used in the cases in which there was no escape from using that water for purification. There was no alternative to using that water for purification. An example of that is clearing someone, even a child, of ritual impurity, even if one's purification was performed according to a school whose conditions do not fulfill the conditions of the Shafi'i school, because we're learning Shafi'i fiqh. Therefore, despite that the child's wudu is not obligatory, it is not valid to use the child's used wudu water because he had to use it for the validity of his prayer. So used water is water that there was no escape from using that water. The child had to use that water or else his prayer wouldn't be valid, even though the prayer is not obligatory on him until he reaches puberty. Even the ghusl water of the Jewish or Christian wife cannot be reused, although she did not have a valid intention, because she had to use that water to allow sexual intercourse. So what if a Hanafi made wudu without an intention? That's valid according to the Hanafis. Wudu with no intention. You, as a Shafi'i, practicing Shafi'i school, you still cannot use his used water because he had to use that water for his prayer. And, i.e. also, for the validity of using the water for purification, it must not have been a small amount used to remove a najis filth, whether exempted or not. This means that assuming that the water retained its purity after using it to remove filth, it still lost its purifying power by being used to lift filth. Meaning, just like we said, when you use the water to remove the hadath, the religious impurity, so now that water lost its power and the organ gained purity from that water. Same thing when you use the water for physical najasa. There is a scenario when you can pour the water on top of the filth, clear the filth away, and the water that fell on top of that spot is still pure, not filthy. That water, can you take that and now use it for another purification? No, you cannot. because it's used water. So assuming that the water retained its purity after using it to remove filth, it still lost its purifying power by being used to lift filth. The scenario of a small amount of water remaining pure after clearing filth is pouring it over the filth. It's actually clearing the filth, an undetectable filth, and what runs or drips from the washed surface is not changed, nor did it get heavier after considering what the surface absorbs of water and any debris that gets caught in the water. All right, that's kind of wordy there. I don't want to dwell on that. You poured the water over the filth. Let's say you had an undetectable filth. That means you know there's filth there, even though you can't see it, smell it, or taste it, because you haven't cleaned it yet. So you took water and poured water over that spot. What's the judgment of the water that runs from that spot that was contaminated? A little bit of water. Now this water, as long as it didn't change, and as long as it didn't get heavier, it's still pure, but it's no longer purifying because you used it to lift the physical najasa as opposed to the religious impurity. Therefore, if the filth fell into the water, or if the spot is still contaminated when you pour water over a spot, and that spot is still contaminated, or if the water changed, or the water got heavier, then it's filthy. This will be revisited in the 9th chapter, insha'Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. So if najasa fell into the water, a small amount of water, it's filthy. Unexcused najasa fell into a small amount of water, it's filthy. Or you poured the water over a spot and then you stop pouring and you look and you see the najasa is still there. So that means all the water that ran from that spot is filthy, because the najasa that you poured it over is still there. Or the water changed, or the water got heavier, then the water is filthy. This will be revisited in the 9th chapter. Now follow this final talk here. Now we're going to sum up everything we just said. The synopsis of the 5th, 6th, and 7th conditions is that what falls into the water would either be pure or filthy. We're not talking about the water being pure or filthy. We're talking about the object that got into the water. What falls into the water would either be pure or filthy. If it is pure, a pure object fell into the water, then either it will blend with the water or not. If it does not blend with the water remains pure and purifying. A pure substance fell into the water without blending with the water. The water remains pure and purifying, whether it changed or not. If it blends with the water, then either it changed the water greatly or not. If the pure thing that fell into the water blends with the water, then either it changed the water greatly or not. If it did not change the water greatly, significantly, then it remains pure and purifying. If it changed the water greatly, then either it is usually easy to keep that material out of the water or not. If it is not easy usually to keep that material out of the water, then the water remains pure and purifying. If it is easy to keep that stuff out of the water usually, then once the water loses its name, it is no longer purifying. If what fell into the water was filth, then either it is excused or not. Either that filth is excused or not. If it is, the water remains pure and purifying. If it is not, if that filth is not excused, it's a contaminating filth, then either it is a large amount of water or not. If it is a large amount of water, then either the filth changed the water or not. If it did not change that large amount of water, then the water is still pure and purifying. If it changed even slightly, it becomes filthy. If the water was a small amount, then it becomes filthy even if it does not change. Finally, pure water that is not purifying is of two types. Either it's changed or it's used. Why would pure water not be purifying? Either because it changed or because it was used. As for the changed water, it was discussed. It was just discussed. And if it was used, then that is either for lifting religious impurity or for removing filth. When using it means you used it either for the hadath, the religious impurity, or the najas, the physical filth, the physical impurity. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam, and Allah knows best.